It is my pleasure to introduce someone who I consider a dear friend and esteemed colleague and collaborator, Rachel Weston Rowell. And Rachel is, in my eyes, one of the original Agilists, if you will, like an early wave Agilist. And it was 2013 that I actually attended my first training with Rachel. And Rachel is a fantastic trainer, but even more than that, an amazing facilitator and someone who is able to really read the room and bring out some of the uncomfortable conversations. And as evidenced in a recent webinar that she did for Agile Leadership Journey on confronting racism, as well as our topic today. Rachel's superpower of facilitation is typically applied in executive leadership contexts, strategic planning and even just executive leadership team function or dysfunction, if you will, and helping them become a better team. And beyond that, she is dealing with uncertainty and complexity every day by having an awesome policy for Roxy's 9, right? For her 9-year-old, that she's always allowed to interrupt. She's always allowed. It's totally safe. I love that policy, but it definitely makes for interesting times, especially.
But a lot of times it looks like.
I think I just did that a little while ago.
Yeah, like, excuse me, one sec. Because then she's just like.
And Rachel is also an avid, I guess, in figuring out how it works now, improv artiste, if you will. I think that's fairly well-rounded intro. So Rachel,
thanks, Randy.
take it away. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, this would be fun with like an intimate group like this. We can actually make this a little bit more conversational than when I presented on this in the past. So feel free to jump in with questions or stop me, and we can make this more of a back and forth rather than a Rachel talks and then we save questions for the end. So I'm gonna share my screen. Thank you, Randy, for that very kind introduction. I'm up in the mountains and it is crazy smoky, so forgive if I get a little bit choked up. It's not nice outside. The world is ablaze. All right, can you see my screen?
Yep.
Oh, dang it. I did that thing where I forgot to select share computer sound. Trying again, please hold. There we go. Sorry, guys. Okay, trying again, here we go. No. Sorry. There, finally. Okay, hopefully my sound is shared. And I'm gonna go into present mode. So we're gonna talk about this concept called the double bind. And the double bind is one of several sociological theories and structures that exist around gender bias. And so we're going to use it as a way to talk about gender bias and how that limits the leadership and growth for women and for people who identify as women. And so this is a discussion for women and for allies, but we're going to be looking at the cost of gender bias for women and thereby for organizations and teams where women make up half of the workforce. So Randy did a great intro. I don't think I need to say much more. The slides say Agile Leadership Journey, which is a community of coaches that Randy and I are both members of, and always looking for more amazing people to join us. My personal company is shockingly called Weston Rowell Consulting, so you can find me there. And I am based in Denver. All right, so let's jump in. So what is this thing called the double bind? So to kick us off in understanding this, I'm actually going to play a video. So maybe Sally or Randy, give me a thumbs up to make sure you can hear it once I press play.
All around me are familiar faces, worn out places, worn out faces. filling up their glasses. No expression, no expression. Mad world, mad world.
All right, so that actually is a ad from the hair care company Pantene, of all things. They had a whole series about labels. But I really like that as a way to understand what the double bind is, because it gives us a glimpse into some of the challenges that women face. And what it helps us start to get access to is this problem where there are stereotypes and cultural assumptions around what it means to be an acceptable woman. And then there are stereotypes and cultural assumptions around what it means to be an expected leader. And unfortunately, those things do not overlap. And so as a woman, if you behave in a way that is considered acceptable for a woman, being kind, being patient, being quiet, being soft, being a caregiver, then you are not perceived as what would be expected of a leader. And if you instead, as a woman, give off leadership behaviors like being strong, assertive, decisive, tough, then you are exhibiting behavior that is unacceptable for a woman. And so there is a conflict inside of the perception of people in our society when women try to be leaders. And that conflict is what we call the double bind, because you get stuck in the situation where you are kind of damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? And so words are a good way to access the double bind, because stereotypes often show up in our language. And so when we are working against cultural norms and working against standard stereotypes, we get a lot of labels, as that video showed, that express discomfort or dissatisfaction with these sort of anti-traditional or anti-expected behaviors. So we can think about when women, when women are very, emotional or effusive in a role of a leader, which would be kind of acceptable woman behaviors, then they're not really a leader, they're a cheerleader, right? But if a woman is tough and assertive as a leader, well, now she's an ice queen. You know, she's not soft anymore. She's not kind. There's something icy and awful about her. And that would mean like she wouldn't be attractive. That kind of woman was probably single and lonely, because who would want to be with a woman like that, right? Women who express too much emotion as perceived of what's acceptable for a woman. So if a woman is in a meeting and, pounds her hand on the table or says, I really disagree with that, now she's angry. And that really gets exacerbated for women of color, right? There's very much stereotypes around like the angry Black woman, right? So these can be exacerbated by additional stereotypes in society. We can also see that a woman who acts like a leader, now she's tough, right? And there's even caricatures that you can see, pictures of strong women leaders, particularly in politics or sports. When they get drawn in cartoons, they're often overly muscled and kind of overly aggressive. You've probably seen these pictures before. When women express emotion in meetings, they're considered too emotional, right? And get labeled as that. But when, along with what I was saying about tough, if they don't express feeling, or they, say it doesn't bother them, now they're being masculine. That can't be a feminine trait, that's a masculine trait. And then if women, let's say, actually, interestingly enough, in a class I was taking today, we were looking at an example of a man who was in a coaching situation, and he talked about that he felt uncomfortable giving the women who reported to him feedback because he was afraid they would cry. And this is like kind of built-in stereotype that women are weak, that we can't take it. bound up in that also is that there's something wrong with crying, but that's a whole other situation. That when you're hurt, you shouldn't cry, right? But this is like an expression of being weak. And then lastly, that women who try to be successful or assertive in wanting their success, that they're conniving, right? So there's plenty of other words that we can find in the world around this, but these words are symbols of the underlying systemic problem, which is that we do not have a safe overlap in many cases between what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a leader. Another place to sort of access this phenomenon is when words that are more traditionally associated with women, when we want to use them in leadership situations, and how we have to sort of twist and bend them to fit the circumstance. So some of you may have heard or read about the popularity of the concept of vulnerability in leadership these days. Brene Brown is one of the authors who's made it very popular. It's showing up in other places. But when you hear people talk about vulnerability, what you'll discover is that they have to sort of do work to take vulnerability, which historically has been associated with the feminine, right? It's about openness and softness, right? Might even be perceived as weak. And they have to twist it to be something that's strong. Because when we talk about vulnerability at work, what we say is, we need vulnerability. And you know what vulnerability takes? Courage. To be vulnerable, you have to be brave. Vulnerability is actually strength, right? So we have to shift the word out of the acceptable woman place into the expected leader place before we can use it there. And that's more evidence of the double bind, that it's not okay to just say, yeah, leaders should be vulnerable. What's wrong with that? Right? We have to morph the meaning of the word and the underlying intent of the word to make it work. So at its core, the double bind is a situation that women find themselves in where they are either perceived as too nice to be an expected leader, or they are perceived as too authoritative to be an acceptable woman. Right? So that's the double bind. So one of the things to pay attention to with the double bind is what comes first. So when I walk into or show up on a Zoom in a room as a leader, as an educator, as a coach, the first thing people are going to notice about me is not whether or not I'm a leader, but that I'm a woman, right? So woman comes first in most situations for women. And so those stereotypes get loaded up initially in the brains of the people who perceive you. And if we think about what is a woman in our society, I just did this search for woman images on Google. And if you look at the categories that are around women, it's beautiful and body and chest and natural, right? So what are people thinking? You know, this is Google's algorithm. When they think about women, it's a lot about your body and how you look, right? So when you first move into a space, there's a lot of loading up of ideas that has to do with your physicality and whether or not you are an acceptable version of a woman. When we think about leader, like when I search for this, we see just very kind of like business terms: team, business, boss, manager. And what I think is interesting here is many of the pictures that we see are men, right? Which I think is, again, evidence that what we think of as leader more tightly aligns to what we think of as man than what we think of as woman. I mean, can you imagine like searching for leader and searching for like beautiful leader, chest leader, body leader, right? These things do not overlap, right? But you could absolutely imagine searching for businessman, boss man, manager man, right? Those overlap. So I actually want to do a little brainstorming with you guys and think about and get you guys to share some ideas with me. So I'm going to go out of presentation mode for a second. So I'd love to hear some of the stereotypes, the words that we can think of in our society that relate to men. And it could be good or bad. They don't have, these are, I'm not looking for necessarily negative, but what are words that we use that are stereotypes of men?
Strong.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
Confident.
Confident. Mm-hmm.
Oblivious.
Oblivious, yeah.
Yeah, and I think confident and oblivious often go together.
They are, one leads to the other.
Yes.
I think the word you're looking for is focused.
I used to work with a wonderful man who used to say he was belligerently confident. I always loved that language. One more stereotype that we have in our society about men.
Provider.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a
Good
good
one.
one. All right, so thinking of these stereotypes of men, I want you to now hold those in your mind and think about what happens in your mind when women exhibit these behaviors. So hold a woman in your mind and then think of these words. What does your mind do with that information? You're seeing a woman, she's strong, she's aggressive, she's confident, she's oblivious, she's focused. Provider, maybe that one works, depending on what you mean.
I think that's a leader.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think also think about, are you having any incongruence about women and these words? Because what I'm hoping to help elucidate for you is that even if you perceive of yourself as somebody who doesn't want to engage in gender bias, you know, you're a woman perhaps, you're like, I don't want to be gender biased, I'm a woman, it's happening to me. You perceive as yourself as open-minded, as somebody who doesn't engage in these things, you still have bias. It is in the air we breathe. It is what we have been brought up with. It is in all of the media we see, the books we read, the messages we get from people. You cannot escape it. It is in the fabric of our society. So no matter how much we might want to not hold those stereotypes, they are there and they will manifest in our minds. So when a woman is being aggressive, we will have a reaction to that, right? Because those stereotypes do not connect to each other. And we'll think that's wrong, right? Or that seems weird, or wow, what's happening with her? Or like, she must be really angry, right? To be aggressive in her desires, where we might not think the same thing for men. So let's think about what are some stereotypes of women?
Thoughtful,
Mm-hmm.
gentle,
Mm-hmm.
Considerate.
Mm-hmm. What else?
Caretaker.
Mm-hmm. Nuanced from provider, right?
Sensitive.
Sensitive. Mm-hmm. That's a good one. So hold these in your mind now and think about, how does your brain react when you think of a leader exhibiting these behaviors? So a sensitive leader, a gentle leader, right? You may be able to partition that to somebody you know and turn it in, like, remember, like the changing of the vulnerability, you can kind of do that twist in your mind. But think about, like, are you going through any motions to make those words fit your understanding of what a leader is? And so that's just helping you access that this is there for all of us, that it is built into the system. It's not something that people are necessarily doing intentionally, and it's happening for all of us to some extent all the time. And so awareness of that, first of all, is a big step towards dismantling gender bias, is just knowing that it's happening and recognizing it in the moment and being like, oh gosh, I just did that thing. Like, what does that mean? What am I doing with this? All right, so let me go back into presenting. So, so there's a lot of research around this topic, and I wanted to share some of the insights with you that the researchers have done. This is from a woman named Madeline Heilman, and she did a podcast on, an interview on a podcast I love called Hidden Brain. And that's actually where I first got introduced to this concept and became very interested in it. And her research showed that when they took a set of credentials, a set of background and skills, and presented it to people as qualifications for a job that was traditionally held by a man in our culture, and thus thought to require male attributes, that if they presented that information to people as a man, it was seen as good. But if they presented it to people as those attributes being held by a woman, she was seen as less competent than the man with the same set of attributes. So there is something about us perceiving of which gender should have a role, that even with the same qualifications, a woman will be seen as less competent. So you want to understand why we don't have as many women in senior leadership positions. This is one of the reasons why. Because to get access to those positions, women would have to be more competent than a man to even be perceived at the same bar. And so that is a huge challenge to ensuring that we have more representation of women in leadership. The other thing that she discovered is that there are times when you can't ignore their competence, when it's blatantly obvious, right? It's right there in front of you. You cannot ignore it. And what happens then? Well, people have a very negative reaction. They dislike that woman. Highly competent women are often seen as really awful. It makes people uncomfortable. And that's where we start to get these words like quarrelsome, manipulative, cold, back to those words that we were exploring at the beginning. So this is another challenge, is that there's this desire for women to be able to move into these roles in our organizations and in our society. But they have this one hurdle, which is they're often seen as less competent, so it's harder for them to get in. But when they do show their competence, that's seen as a problem. And you can think about, I think this is actually often highly visible in politics. When you see women being competent in politics and listen to the language that is applied to their competence and to their success. And there's a lot of discomfort often with that. I think sports is another place where we see it. Right? You can look at Serena and Venus Williams and some of the criticism that they have taken over the years about their success, because they are wildly successful, undeniably two of the best tennis players in history. And yet, if you look at the language and the headlines around their success, you can see this manifesting. So what's the cost of this? Because clearly this sucks, right? Well, it means that women have to prove that they're competent over and over again, right? It's like a constant proof point of like, no, really, actually, I can do this. I am capable. I can perform. It means that we have to spend time thinking about how we're being perceived so we can manage that, right? Like, are they seeing my competence? Am I being judged fairly? How are they seeing it? Am I being a good woman? Am I being a good leader? We have to spend time compensating so that we aren't too assertive or too nice, and kind of threading that needle of like balancing both worlds so that we get to somehow be successful. And that is like walking a line, right? It's like this constant balancing act of like, I'm trying to do my job and I'm trying to be successful, but I'm also managing all of these externalities that are happening around me. And it's like a tightrope that we're walking all of the time, right? And that's exhausting. And it's taking away our energy from other things we could be doing. There's kind of an additional like painful truth about what's happening in this situation, because we can be walking this tightrope, but we can say, you know what, it's one line, and yes, it's challenging, but I can walk it, right? I can do it all. I can be the leader and I can be the woman, and I will figure out how to do it, and I will just stretch myself a little further and I will make it happen. But this one line, if we zoom back out from it, what we will discover is it's just one of many. And this is a metaphor I picked up from a beautiful essay by a woman named Madeline Fry, which is that she said, if you zoom out from this line, what you start to see is that there are lines everywhere. And it's not that we are walking one line, it's that we are trapped in a bird cage. That these lines are actually a cage containing us. And so I'm going to share with you a quote from this essay that she wrote on this, because I just think it's incredibly powerful. And I'm going to put it up on the screen, but I'm also going to read it because I think it's beautiful and painful to hear it. So she said, women are caught like this too by networks of forces and barriers that expose one to penalty, loss, or contempt, whether one works outside the home or not, is on welfare or not, bears children or not, raises children or not, marries or not, stays married or not, is heterosexual, lesbian, both or neither. The experience of oppressed people is that the living of one's life is confined and shaped by forces and barriers which are not accidental or occasional and hence avoidable, but are systematically related to each other in such a way as to catch one between and among them, and restrict or penalize motion in any direction. It is the experience of being caged in. All avenues in every direction are blocked or booby-trapped. And to me, that is the essence of this issue, is that the double bind is not just one thing versus another. It manifests in all areas of our life. So we're talking about leadership, but this thing is everywhere. This is in how you choose to be a parent or not. This is in how you choose to work or not. This is in how you choose to have friends or not, right? It is all around us in the system all the time. So the cost of this is not only the cost of us at work, but the mental pressure that it puts on us in every aspect of our life. And that is unacceptable, right? I think we should all feel like we don't want women spending time on this. This is not how we are going to make a great society, is by worrying about these things. There are much bigger problems to be solved. So this is systemic. It is all around us all the time. And there are compounding biases, right? We have been talking about the bias of gender, but for many women, this is additive to other biases that they experience. So whether that's racism or ableism or ageism or whatever other things they're experiencing, these can be compounding biases that just make that cage have more and more bars on it. So, whew, that's rough. That's a lot to take in. That is a tough feeling to absorb. And when we experience gender bias, it is hurtful and it wears on us as women. And so I want to just spend a minute exploring, what is that feeling? That that pain, that frustration, where is it coming from? So what I think is happening when we experience gender bias is that our brain is feeling a sense of threat. And so I want to talk a little bit about threat response in our brain and what it's doing. So anybody familiar with the hand model of the brain? Anybody seen this before? So the way it works is if you take your hand and hold it palm out, this part down here, the sort of fleshy part of your hand and your wrist, that's like your brain stem. That's where like heartbeat, breathing, just basic life functions happen. If you fold your thumb across, that's like your limbic system. That's like reptile brain, emotion brain, devoid of language, where reaction comes from. And then if you fold your fingers over the top, that's like your neocortex, that's your frontal lobe, all of your executive processing. That's where, good human decision-making happens, right? So limbic system is I like chocolate, folded over a frontal lobe is you've had too much chocolate today. Right? That's how I like to think about it. So when we experience a threat, our brain has a built-in system developed over many, many millennia to help us respond in a way to keep us safe. And that system was built, out on the savannas of Africa. So we could sort of imagine a world in which like we'd be cruising along and then there's a lion. And it's like, okay, that's super dangerous. And now you're under threat. And when we're under threat, our brain has three responses. The three Fs, which are fight, flight, or freeze. Right? So given any situation of mortal danger, you're either gonna, try to punch the lion in the nose, or you're gonna run as fast as you can away from him, or you're gonna freeze and play possum dead, right? Those are the options that we have. And when threat takes over our brain, what happens is we basically flip our lid. Our executive function goes offline, and we are all limbic system response. We're all, I like chocolate. Right? And we stay that way until we can get out of threat mode and this processing can come back online. That is how the brain is designed, because we don't actually need this system taking up energy when we're in threat. All we need to do is react and get to safety. So that is what's happening, is that I'm freaking out. I'm in threat mode, thinking part offline, react until I'm in safety, then thinking back online. And that's all well and good, except that same system gets triggered by things that are not about physical safety, right? Our threat systems are triggered by things that impact our psychological safety. So we are not actually in physical danger, but the same system is functioning when we're psychologically threatened. So this is a model from a guy named David Rock from a book called Your Brain at Work. It's called the SCARF model. And what he's helping us peel apart are the different areas of psychological safety that can be triggered and cause us to go into a threat response. So I'll tell you a story of a time when I experienced gender bias. I was working for a man who is one of the best bosses I've ever had, a man who I still to this day adore. I considered him a mentor, an investor in my success and career, and just somebody I have a lot of fondness for. And I got pregnant while I was working for him, and I was getting ready to go out on maternity leave. I led a very big part of the organization, and so I was doing a ton of work trying to prepare that part of it work for me to be gone for 3 months. And I was very pregnant, and I was very uncomfortable, and I just wanted to be done. And I was in his office for one of the final meetings of me kind of explaining the plan that I had put in place for my maternity leave. We were talking through it, and I was kind of like, I think I've got it all buttoned up. And he said to me, I have a question for you. Do you really think you're going to come back from maternity leave? And I felt like in that moment that my brain just shut off. I couldn't hear anything else. I was incredibly upset, incredibly upset. And I couldn't even in that moment probably have told you why, but looking back on it, he set off my threat response. So in that statement of, do you really think you're going to come back from maternity leave? What, if we think about my status, my certainty, my autonomy, my relatedness, my fairness, what do you think he might have triggered with that statement?
Hi, Brad. How are you?
Certainty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm suddenly wondering, wait, are you going to give my job away? Like, are you trying to give my job away? What else might he have triggered?
Fairness.
Yeah, I'm thinking, you wouldn't ask a man this. What the hell?
Well,
What else?
relatedness too, because you probably feel like he knows you better than that.
Yeah, I'm like, wait, is everything about our relationship suddenly false? Like, why are you asking? We've talked about this. Autonomy, right? Like, excuse me, is this not my decision to make? Like, what's going on here? And status, right? Like, all of a sudden I'm feeling like where, he believed in me as a leader. I'm like, wait a second, what is going on here? So it really was a trigger across all these areas for me. And because I is in threat mode, what I did in response is I said to him, of course I'm coming back, right? I told him what he wanted to hear, or at least what I thought he wanted to hear. And I think that's the challenge, is that we're in threat response, we're experiencing fear and stress, right? And we are not creative. We cannot access the right thing to say, right? To be in safety and creativity, we actually need our brain to be in reward mode, right? With thinking online. We need to be in a creative thought mode. And this is that feeling that I think all of us have had when somebody says something to you that's upsetting, and then later you think of that like sick burn that you wish you'd said back to them, right? This is like, you were here, threat mode, and you needed to be here, right? And of course, later I was like, what I should have said.
Oh yeah, the jerk store called and they said
Yeah,
they're calling you.
That's right. And so it's just this real challenge of like, you cannot be creative. You cannot access even how you're feeling, why that bothers you, what you want to do about it in that moment while you are in threat mode. Right. And I think, to me, this is what is happening every time we experience gender bias. It's just constant triggering of that threat mode, that constant feeling of like, what does that mean? Why is that person saying that to me? Why wouldn't they say that to somebody else? Like, are they suggesting something? Is my job at stake? Am I, it's relentless. And when it's happening, it is taking us out of our ability to be thoughtful, engaged members of our teams, and instead putting us in this mental state of being back on our heels. And that is incredibly painful. It's exhausting, right? I mean, threat mode is a highly active brain state, so it's using extra energy, which is why we often feel sort of like, oh, after something like that happens, after the adrenaline rush goes away. And so when this happens over and over again, I actually think it starts to create a sense, an experience of trauma, right? Repeated threat is trauma. And so microaggressions, right, day in and day out, they create trauma in the body. And there is research on this. Actually, I took a class last night on anti-racism that was wonderful. The woman who taught it is named Reagan Bird, and I would promote her all up and down the world. She's Denver based. But she shared with us research about the impact on African Americans of repeated racism and the actual physical trauma that it creates in bodies. And I think we could expect the same thing to be true here. So how do we access our creativity when we are experiencing threat? How do we get our creative function back online so that we can respond in a useful way, so that we can get back to doing the work? Well, I want to start by talking about coping strategies, because while we live in a system that creates gender bias through stereotypes, we are going to have to learn to cope, right? The system is what it is. We experienced that when we did our little thought experiment at the beginning. And until the system changes, we've got to cope within it. So I want to share some strategies for the kind of near term, and then we're going to talk long-term change. So one thing we can do is compensate for other people's biases. I actually read an article about this. And when I first read it, it made me angry because I was like, I don't want to have to compensate for other people's biases. Please tell me that that is not the answer to this situation. But as I thought about it, I thought, you know, the truth is, this is where we are. This is what we have to do. And so a couple of the things that this article talked about in terms of compensating for others' biases is that, one, in the moment of threat, one thing you can do for yourself is give yourself time. So if I could rewind, right, and go back to that room with my boss, and he says that to me, what could I have done to give myself a pause, a moment to sort of reflect on what's happening to me, get my brain back in gear, and realize what I actually want to do with this situation, right? Instead of having that immediate reaction, which was me saying, of course I'm going to come back, right? Which was my threat response. So how do we give ourselves time? How do we allow ourselves to evaluate the actual scarf situation that we're having? Well, I think there are some pause techniques you could use. So things I've thought about for myself is, why are you asking me that? You know, I'm not sure I actually want to know, but it's going to give me a minute. And maybe hearing why they're asking me that may help me uncover that what I think is happening maybe isn't happening, right? That's possible too. So say more about what you're thinking there, right? Hold on, I need to think about what you just said. Whatever works for you, I think giving yourself a moment can be really helpful. And sometimes you're going to miss the moment. Sometimes you're not going to get yourself back into thinking state while it happens. And I think we have to give ourselves space for that too. It's okay. But if we can give ourselves time, I think that's a good first step. In addition to that, I think we can look for some small wins, and maybe they become big. So in terms of managing the biases, this article asked a bunch of senior leaders who were women what they do to manage in this system. So several of them talked about adapting to the situation. So this is about taking some time to sort of read the room, right? Is this a group that's going to respond more to me being the sort of the stereotypical woman, or is this a group that's going to respond more to me being the stereotypical leader? Go in order. This is about the perception of you as a woman first, leader second. So you can show up and be nice first, assertive second. That sort of follows the pattern that's happening in people's brains. Looking for places that are kind of values driven, where you can do that twisting of concepts that we talked about with vulnerability, where nice and tough converge, right? And starting to help kind of people see that the behaviors that you have, like that the woman can be leader, right? And looking for those intersections. By being tough on tasks but soft on people, right? That tends to be more acceptable for women. And then doing more of that reframing language that we just talked about. The other thing that women can do is get credit. So this is more research by Madeline Heilman. And what she discovered in her research is that working women often don't get credit when they participate in collaborative work? Well, that might matter for Agile teams, right? When women participate in group activities, they are far less likely to be acknowledged for the same level of contribution as their male peers. So what we need to do as women, and our male allies can help with this, is make women's contributions clear. Women should self-promote. I know that can feel very uncomfortable, but you're already starting at a deficit. So self-promotion may just get you to equal. And so it's probably worth it. Be clear about what your role is. And if this group has a spokesperson, raise your hand to be that person. Be in the spotlight. And that can be uncomfortable, but these are the types of things we may need to do to get equal consideration. So that's coping. But I want to talk about system strategies. I want to talk about what it would mean to actually create a world without gender bias, to change the system itself so that the overlap between woman and leader is whole. And we don't have to be stretching and compensating and managing to be considered good leaders and good members of teams. So how are we going to do that? Well, women hold 50.4% of the jobs in America as of January of this year. That was the first time that women are a majority in the workforce. So there are lots of us. So we have lots of opportunities to participate in making change in the very systems in which we work in. And what we're going to do is overthrow the patriarchy. Okay. So if when I said that, you had a little bit of a like twinge reaction, that's totally understandable. That is a big thing to say. And it can make people uncomfortable. And I want to investigate a little bit why it makes us uncomfortable. Why does it make people uncomfortable when I say we're going to overthrow the patriarchy? Well, guys, this is where the stereotypes and language get really twisted up because it is a rabbit hole. The reason why we're having that reaction is because the very terms of gender bias have been gendered. So the term feminism, which means advocating for equal treatment for women, and the term patriarchy, which means a society that privileges men, have been gendered. We associate feminism with women and we associate patriarchy with men. And so if I say overthrow the patriarchy, what we think I'm saying is overthrow men. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes it sound like what I'm saying is there's something wrong with men and we need to stop them. But overthrow the patriarchy means overthrow a societal system that privileges men over women and make it equal, right? Being a feminist means advocating for equal treatment for women. So even the language of the work that we need to do is gendered. And that is what makes it so hard to pull it apart. So when I say overthrow the patriarchy, I mean it. But I mean it in the way of we need to fix a broken system that privileges one gender over the other and make it a system that treats us equally. We're not asking for more, we're asking for equal. And why should we care about that? Why should we want to do that? Well, because when women spend time proving their value and competence and managing the biases of others and just advocating for themselves to get a fair chance, that means we're not bringing our whole selves and everything that we have to offer to solving the toughest problems in the world. And for that, everybody suffers. We all lose, right? So we should all want to overthrow this patriarchal system because it is hurting all of us. It is diminishing the possibility for all of us. Right? And that's something we should all be deeply concerned about. So what do we need to do to start making system level change? Well, part of this is about internal work. It's that recognizing that we all have our implicit biases. All of us do this. Women engage in gender bias too. Because of that, I talked about it's in the system. It's in the very air we breathe. Know that you have these biases and explore them. Be curious about them and be kind to yourself about them. Know that it's going to make you uncomfortable and know that you're going to make mistakes. I probably made mistakes in this presentation, just talking about it. And then we need to use our power. So for our allies, right? For men in our lives, you have so much power to change the very system itself. right? Because you are in the power position. We need you to help make these changes. And in my anti-racism class last night, I loved that one of the things she said is that allyship is an action, not an adjective, right? Allyship is motion, it's doing, right? Just calling yourself an ally isn't enough. White women, we have much more power than women of color. So we can use our power to make changes in the system. Anybody who's in a leadership role, man or woman, has power. Investors have power. The amount of money that goes to female founded startups in the United States is like less than 4% of the total amount invested every year. I mean, that's horrifying, right? We could change that. HR has tons of power over hiring policies, how people are promoted, how jobs are described, how work hours are created. Like, there's a lot of research that shows that because women are often caregivers in their family, either to children or to elderly parents, traditional work hours often don't work for them, right? So how could we create different work hours that create more equity and allow more women to participate? I'm a coach, right? I get a chance to sit and advise people on how they should behave and structure their companies. Right? So I feel like it's my responsibility to use that power to make change. So in terms of allyship, what does it look like to be an ally, whether that's as a man or a woman in power? Well, one thing is to speak up. When you hear gender stereotype language that is negative, say something, right? Call it out. Why are we using those words? Why are we talking about her like that? Is that really what we mean? Would we say that if she was a man? Right? Can we think about another way to frame this? Imagine a reverse gender when you're evaluating somebody. You know, if you're thinking about a woman and her performance, what if she was a man? Would you be evaluating her the same way? And promote women's accomplishments. Shine a light on what they're doing so that we can start to see that they're producing at an equal level to men. So what I'll end with here is that overcoming systemic gender bias, it's not a one-time action, right? It's not, I give this presentation and we fixed it. It's a journey, and it's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of time, but it's worth it, because we will be so much better as a society and as organizations and as teams when everybody on the team is able to participate at the same level and engage at the same level. All right.